Hi, this is Yulia, and here we are once again in Cuba. Last time, we talked about the beginning of one of the most legendary revolutions in the history of the 20th century.
Like Henry Adams, we say, give me liberty or give me death.
The Cuban Revolution had no political affiliation and, contrary to common belief, was not in any shape or form sponsored or supported by the most important communist country at that time, the USSR. Today, we will see how the Castro Revolution morphed into a socialist one, thus setting itself on a collision course with its giant neighbor and its former protector and benefactor, the United States. I have read many accounts that this confrontation was inevitable. I don't believe that's the case. True, Fidel had some left-leaning ideas of redistribution of land, but so did de Gaulle in France. Beyond the vague ideas, however, Castro knew that Cuba had an impossible economic road ahead, and it needed help. The US was right next door and in a position to help. In contrast, the Soviet Union was thousands of miles away, with Khrushchev as a leader that hardly knew anything about Cuba. In keeping with the manifesto of Sierra Maestro, an interim government that included all opposition groups assumed power. The elections were scheduled to take place 18 months later. While Castro did have a lot of power, he could not and would not stop the inevitable score settling. This changed the uncharacteristically bloodless revolution into a more typical bloodbath. In less than 3 months, more than 500 Batista supporters, or those who were accused of being such, were publicly tried and executed. I don't think Fidel wanted to be known for excessive violence, but when the choice came between absolute power and fairness, he chose power and allowed the revolution to devour not only its enemies, but its own children. The sentiment in the US was fueled further by the horrific stories told by many Cubans who escaped to Miami. Despite his highly sensational visit to New York in April 1959, the fascination with Fidel Castro started to dwindle. The US offered Cuba economic assistance, which Castro refused.
What happened is that here you in the United States are accustomed to see government coming for money. No, I came for good relations.
While actively denying any communist affiliation in his government.
An American magazine published here this week says that your brother is a communist and his wife also.
And
do you believe that?
How US is going to know that better than myself, that is my brother and my sister-in-law. I can't tell that they are not communist.
And then came the agrarian reform of May 1959, with the Castro family farm being one of the first nationalized properties. To say that Fidel's mother, Lena, was unhappy would be the understatement of the century. In fact, she never forgave her increasingly left-leaning son. While 200,000 peasants received a title to their own land, the existing landowners lost everything, with no compensation. Many moderate members of the coalition government resigned in protest. Their places were taken by the members of the Cuban Communist Party. Few Cubans noticed this shift in government, as the first year of the revolution was quite miraculous. Rents were slashed in half, prices stabilized, and public works projects popped up all over the island. What Cubans did not see was that the money was running out. Since Fidel built his image as a liberator from the semi-colonial past, turning to the former master, the US, was not a very easy political move, even if it was economically logical. Castro flirted with the Soviets by inviting Anastas Mikoyan, the Soviet deputy premier, to Havana. This visit might have been the crucial turning point, with huge red flags, literally and figuratively, being raised in every quarter of the military and intelligence communities in the United States. Cuba, only 90 miles away from Florida, was seen as a giant aircraft carrier from which the Soviets could threaten US security. And when Castro signed the oil for sugar deal with the Soviet Union, the US administration began to view him as siding with the Soviets. Castro, on the other hand, saw the overwhelming dominance of the US firms that were in control of much of the Cuban infrastructure as a solution to his fiscal problems. When the first shipment of Soviet oil arrived in Cuba in June of 1960, Castro insisted that the US oil companies refine 1 million barrels of Soviet crude, which they refused. In response, Castro used it as an excuse to nationalize US oil refineries, thus starting a chain of retaliations, eventually resulting in a complete breakdown of diplomatic relations between the two countries. Castro authorized nationalization of all US properties, while making his blossoming bromance with Nikita Khrushchev very public. As the United States became increasingly hostile towards Cuba, the trickle of Cuban immigration to the US became a flood. Cuban exiles organized themselves into a mighty anti-Castro movement, becoming a powerful lobby. That's when the CIA began planning to get rid of Castro. Looking back, the CIA efforts were equally as illegal and immoral as they were laughable and pathetic. In addition to the very well-known Bay of Pigs operation, which we will talk about in our next episode, the CIA allegedly came up with some really weird plans to assassinate the Cuban leader. Two of the oddest revolved around Castro's passion for scuba diving. One called for an explosive seashell to be planted in an area where he liked to dive, and the other involved a wetsuit tainted with a disease-causing fungus and a tuberculosis-laced breathing apparatus. Other proposed instruments of death included a fountain pen that concealed a hypodermic needle so fine that being stabbed by it would be undetectable. Somehow, all of them failed, forcing the CIA to resort to more traditional methods, such as training an army of Cuban exiles in Guatemala for a possible invasion of the island. In September of 1960, Castro went after the US during his speech before the United Nations, while giving sweet bear hugs to Nikita Khrushchev. Just 1 month later, the US imposed a trade embargo against Cuba. On January 1st, the United States broke all diplomatic relations with Cuba. The stage was set for a great upheaval. Few people on all sides of this conflict could have imagined how far this escalation would go. But these are the topics of the next 2 episodes: the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thanks so much for watching. Please like us, love us, adore us, and subscribe to my channel. Say it with me, Rebels and Revolutions.